I have finally caught up on Kingdom. And for a long time, this has been my second favorite manga of all time. And this was just reading about half of the series. I would always stop at the end of the Coalition arc. It was just such a good ending for what would have been like that story. Obviously, there's loose ends that didn't get tied up, but when it comes to just telling a satisfying story, that bit was just done so incredibly well. And I think it still just landed it very easily within my top 5, and I was comfortable putting it at number 2 for a very long time at this point. And now I finally decided to push forward deeper into the series to the point where now I am 100% caught up on the Kingdom manga, and it has been just such an amazing ride. Now, when it comes to just some general thoughts on the series, some of the best aspects to it, Shin and Sei, their dynamic as protagonist and protagonist, I think is one of the best out there. Obviously, there are some ones that you can really compare it to in terms of it just being in that upper echelon. Obviously, Guts and Griffith, when it comes to their dynamic within the Golden Age arc specifically, this is obviously before Griffith becomes the antagonist of the story, and we kind of see their different perspectives. And I wouldn't necessarily consider Griffith too much of the Durotagonist at that point, but I do think he technically qualifies within the definition of what a Durotagonist is. But more accurate representations of what a good Durotagonist is characters like Sasaki Kojiro from Vagabond, or even Mataji, characters that we do get just dedicated storylines to where we follow their perspective for long periods of time. This is kind of what happens with Sei, and I think it's just done so incredibly well here because they each have very different types of stories, with Shin's, of course, being very action heavy. He's a soldier and he's fighting to get to the point where he is a great general. Sei, he is the king of his nation. It's very political, and it's two very different types of stories being told. Before I go any further, I would like to preface spoilers. I have another Kingdom video where I think I go over spoilers in that one too, but it's definitely less spoiler filled than this video because I'm not really putting any effort to filter anything out really. But when it comes to another aspect that I absolutely love, it is the Hishin unit, and the way I view this unit, I think it's how a lot of One Piece fans view the Straw Hats. Like, almost all the characters that have any type of prominence are phenomenal. Like, they're just great side characters. Obviously, they're not as complex, they're not as layered as the main cast. Most of them don't compare in that specific way, but as side characters, they're fantastic. And even characters that get recruited later on in different ways, characters like Naki is probably the most relevant in terms of characters that got added later on. I loved Naki's character for while he was in the Hishin unit, and there's so many other characters that fit within that same realm as Naki. And then of course the characters that have been there from the beginning, they've had so much more time to develop throughout the entire story. But of course, not everything can just be absolutely fantastic. There was a character I complained about in my first video that I still absolutely hate. He has a purpose in the story, I guess, but in all honesty, every time he comes on the screen, or the phrasing, every time he becomes a part of the story again, because he's very much that random event type character. And of course, now it should be pretty obvious I'm talking about Hoken. He is just the type of antagonist that appears out of nowhere to shake the story up. He's very much not even a character, and I said this the first time, he's not a character, he's a plot device, and that's essentially why I hate him. He's such a supernatural being, and calling Kingdom grounded feels a little bit like ridiculous, but still, it's a more realistic story than most other battle type stories. But of course, this is historical fiction, and his character just feels super out of place here. And the same thing can be said for a more likable character, a more popular character like Kyokai, but I think that's where just execution comes into effect. Kyokai is just as supernatural, just as ridiculous as a character like Hoken, but the execution, in my opinion, is just way better. And now that, of course, Hoken is dead, It was a lot more satisfying. But of course, the ramifications of his presence in previous parts of the story still are in effect now. And that leads me to talking about Riboku. Now, historically speaking, when it comes to the actual real life lore that this story is based on, Riboku is supposed to be, he's just that dude. And obviously we see him accomplish so many incredible feats throughout the story, but how I explained it before is he would do something incredibly smart, completely outsmarting characters like Oki and of course our main protagonist Shin and just all these other different characters. But then our characters that we're following, like Oki, Shin, and all these other characters, they would find ways out of this situation, and he would end up relying on plot conveniences like Hoken specifically, time and time again, to kind of bail himself out whenever he already had the advantage. And it was kind of just overcome in terms of Riboku overcoming his enemies in just such a ridiculous way in the end, because it felt like such a well executed tug of war just for him to, basically be playing imaginary games. It's like, the best way that I can describe it is like you're playing action figures with a weird kid down the road or something like that, and then you're like, you stab him, you stab his character with your character, his figure with your figure, and then he says, you can't do that, my little figure got armor blessed straight from God. That is the type of storytelling it feels like Riboku has on his side all the time, and it is pretty insufferable, and it's one of my main problems with Riboku as a character. But getting back to the more positive elements, the large-scale warfare here, it just keeps getting more and more insane. Now, I will go ahead and say that nothing has really topped the Coalition arc for me. Of course, the Zhao invasion arc is second place probably, or at least the Zhao war arc, because it is something that's very broad, because there are so many different arcs in this overarching Zhao conflict. So depending on how you want to interpret things, I would say, Coalition, then Zhao, the Zhao arc. I'll just, broadly encompass it that way. But the large-scale warfare in this story is just second to none. There are some stories that can do it in a similar fashion, I would say, probably because they were inspired from it. Stories like Magi specifically, it's obviously a shonen, so a completely different demographic, but Magi does it very well, but it doesn't really hold a candle to how well it's executed within Kingdom. Then there's the political angle, and I love politics when it comes to just really any story. I can even get down with the politics in Star Wars, as messy as that is. It's just the idea of this, mostly unexplored aspect of storytelling, finally getting some shine, and it gets so much shine within Kingdom, which obviously makes a ton of sense, but I can really broaden this positive to the dialogue in general when it comes to this series. It's just written so smart, and especially pairing it with the artistic decisions. The author is just able to portray idealism so well with all of the different characters, and you can kind of just see their philosophy, their attitude, their atmosphere, their presence throughout every single panel. And you of course pair that up with like an insanely, like, whether it's just a scene trying to be cool, a scene trying to be deep, anything like that. I think characters like Sei and Kenki are probably the biggest benefactors from just how great the author is at portraying these specific aspects. And then finally, the art is only gotten better, which is pretty much the case with almost every single manga out there. As long as the author isn't getting burnt out and just worked to the actual bone, the art is going to get better in the series as the author gets more practice, and that's the case here, I can happily say. When it comes to character design, it's all just amazing. I don't want to sit here and just compliment the art consistently, because it was great initially and it is still great now. I like how dynamic it is, and it's just insanely good in my opinion. Now, usually I'll start breaking down each arc individually, but with Kingdom, the way that the whole story is structured, there's a bunch of tiny arcs that I don't really feel like addressing, because some of them are just a couple of issues or a couple of chapters, and that's it. And there's not really too much to extrapolate from it. So I'm really just going to kind of broadly address some of the more significant points, starting with the Western Zhao invasion. And this was such a strong start to the story. The main antagonist for this little arc that we kind of get introduced to, he was a great antagonist, but he did kind of play second fiddle in terms of conflict because, of course, this is when Shin and Kenki get paired up and they have to really just spend a lot of time with each other. And this is when we find out just how nasty of an individual Kenki is. And of course, Shin had a similar moment when it comes to dealing with this nastiness in earlier portions of the story, where he cut down, I think it was just like 1,000-man commander, but it was somebody of pretty significant rank, but obviously not anything close to a great general or anything like that. So this was definitely the most interesting bit when it comes to this arc. Despite the antagonist being actually really good, I would rank him higher than, a character like Riboku, who has a lot of ridiculousness around him. And then there's the portion of the story where we follow Riboku, or at least Riboku's side, pretty significantly for a decent amount of time. And this is where we kind of see Riboku's situation. He's just so much just pulled around by the plot, and of course there's like real life things that the author has to adhere to, and I get that, but seeing Riboku kind of be nerfed by his current king just felt so cathartic. I loved seeing him get shit on by an admittedly very just terrible king, but with all the ridiculous stuff, like I said earlier, that Riboku has kind of pulled off through plot convenience, to see him kind of be a victim of it was just super, it felt really nice. But of course, it's not something that can last forever. Like I said, historically speaking, Riboku is an absolute beast. And of course, he's like that in the Kingdom manga as well. It just happens that our characters have escaped him many, many times before. But as the Zhao invasion just keeps pushing and we go to more and more conflicts, more and more battles, there's a bunch of interesting story beats to kind of touch on, and obviously one of the biggest ones is the death of Hoken. I've already talked about this a little bit, and like I said, I just really loved seeing Hoken finally just be gone from the series. It's this annoying plot device that is just finally absent, and obviously super happy about that. But more so than that, it's just seeing Shin finally coming to the point where he is just actually a great commander, a great general, I guess. But when it comes to seeing him develop over this period of time where he was kind of incompetent before, and there's just so many different moments where he's had to step up, but then it feels like he'll just kind of sink back down. But now it feels like he's just actively leading 24/7, which is such an insane development, something that I love seeing, and the fact that he's picking up the glaive now, consistently using that. The development in this series, I think, is second to none in terms of just seeing a character progress, almost like it's an RPG. He has to reach a certain level requirement to hit, to get armor, to use the glaive. Stuff like that is just an absolute insanely satisfying series from that perspective. But most significantly, in terms of reading anything after the Coalition arc, is Kenki's storyline. Kenki is the best character in the series to me, even though I don't necessarily like Shin's reaction at the end, in regards to him, Kenki, dying, of course, because it kind of felt, in terms of how it was executed, similar to, funnily enough, in Naruto, where after Obito did everything that he did and he dies, Naruto's just like, oh, he was a cool guy. And in terms of Shin's reaction at the end, that's kind of how it felt. It felt very similar to that Obito situation. Now, obviously, given the context, everything that Shin kind of learned about Kenki, his experiences, later, after everything that kind of made Shin hate Kenki, after all of that, Shin did get quite close to him. At least he did develop a certain fondness for him kind of replacing a lot of that hatred, despite that hatred still existing. So the execution wasn't terrible by any means, but there was a little bit of just distastefulness, in my opinion, because of the atrocities Kanki committed. That being said, of course, his storyline was phenomenal. His origin story that we got to see, and just how he developed over time, and specifically his dynamic with Shin, and how he kind of rebutted his entire argument, calling Kanki a monster, and him rebuttaling with Sei, and basically calling Shin and Sei monsters because of their ideology, their intent to unify all of China. This, no matter how many people Kanki kills, because of the king's intent to conquer all of China, there will always be more blood down that path than, of course, down Kanki's path. And I thought that was a really interesting philosophical argument from Kanki. That being said, of course, he is a pretty evil individual. I don't think there's going to be too many arguments about that, but I really like the fact that he pretty much treated Shin the way that he did, with his nasty personality and all, because he liked Shin, and that is something that I definitely found just likable towards his character. And that leads me to what's going on right now within the series, Osen versus Riboku. And I've liked some of the plot developments that we've seen. Mostly what has been so great about this current arc that we're on right now is just how much credit Shin is getting after, of course, all of his accomplishments in war. That's some of the most satisfying aspects within the series, and really any series. It's one of my favorite aspects about One Piece, despite me never really talking about One Piece. It's like seeing the bounties go up, seeing all these characters build a reputation. That is some of the most satisfying parts about reading a series like this. And of course, Kingdom has the added bonuses of Shin earning his glaive, earning his armor, and then of course now earning his reputation. And that has been the best part about this current arc that we're on right now. And funnily enough, despite me consistently complaining about Hoken throughout this entire video, basically, he does seem to seemingly already have a replacement in terms of just Riboku's army, and that's with Shiba Sho, who is just another character who I feel like is going to have a lot of plot convenience to him and stuff like that in regards to Riboku himself, just being that type of character that Hoken was. And I'm not necessarily looking forward to that aspect, and I could be completely wrong. This is just me speculating my theory, I guess. But I did think that that was pretty funny that seemingly Hoken has already been replaced by a pretty similar character in terms of just physical prowess, at least so far. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Kingdom after catching up on the series finally. And it's still my second favorite manga of all time.